Hello and welcome. Now, it's a fact of life that buses, whether preserved or otherwise, will need to move at some point in their lives. Buses, and coaches for that matter, like to be kept active, and being used regularly is good for them. It stops things from seizing up, and it keeps all the oil regularly pumped around the engine, which is good because engines like oil, don't they? Now, another thing is when you own a vehicle over a period of time, whether it's a bus, a coach or a car, you start to build up a relationship with that vehicle. You know its strengths and you know its weaknesses, you know the work that has been done and you know the work that needs to be done. And all of this actually gives you confidence to take the vehicle out on the road, knowing that you're going to get from A to B without coming back on the back of a tow wagon. But sometimes you don't have this chance to build up that relationship, especially when you've just bought a vehicle and you've not done many miles in it at all and you're maybe moving it for the first time. Well, this is what happened to me when I acquired my Leyland Leopard in early 2021. JKM 165V was located in the middle of Sussex in a very remote farm. In fact, so remote I can't even find it today. I've actually looked on Google Earth and I still don't know where it is. And this coming from someone who prides himself in reasonably good navigational skills. So Paul and myself jumped in the car and went down to deepest, darkest Sussex to try and find JKM 165V. We met up with 165's then current owner, my friend Neil, who thankfully took us over to the farm where 165 was located. When we found her, she was parked in a lean-to barn on a farm and hadn't been used for about 6 or 7 years. This genuinely was what people refer to as a barn find. Brambles and creeper were covering the front of the coach and green mould was all over the rest of the coach. But despite all that, you could see that she was solid, in good condition and had been well looked after before that. And so the deal was done, but as they always say, that's the easy part, buying the vehicle. Getting it back home, working on it and owning it is the harder part. A few weeks later, Paul and myself returned to 165 to see what really needed doing. We brought some batteries along and 165 was fired up and there was no apparent problems, no leaks, no nothing. She built up there absolutely lovely. At this point I wasn't sure whether I was going to be driving Leo, as 165 had become known as, back, or whether she would be arriving back on the back of a tow wagon. It appeared there would be minimal amount of work to get Leo on the road. So I decided to take the plunge and drive her the 60 odd miles back to Kent. And the third time that Paul and myself visited Leo was the day of the move. And between the two of us over the course of the day we recommissioned her, making sure that everything worked and was safe, such as brakes and lights, and that the tyres were in good and a legal condition. I'd insured Leo before we left Kent, but I hadn't taxed her just in case things didn't work out and she did need to be towed back. One of the jobs that was identified on the previous visit was a tyre that needed changing, so we managed to get that done and we were good to go. In fact, probably the hardest part there at that point was trying to get a signal on my phone so I could actually go onto the DVLA website and tax her. This done, Leo entered the open road for the first time in 7 years. And despite Leo losing third gear and my bottom twitching like a rabbit's nose, the drive back was a complete success and we arrived in Kent later that evening. But that does show how stressful it can all be when you don't really know a vehicle that well. And while I have breakdown cover as a plan B, and I certainly would never leave home without it, I pride myself on the fact that I don't very often have to use it. So I'd owned Leo for about a year and we'd done several shows together, and then in 2022 we moved to the Isle of Wight and Leo was put into storage. Now, because she had a bit of a big bum and it stuck out the barn, I wrapped that in plastic, and here she stayed for about 10 months. But we were determined to get Leo down on the Isle of Wight to live with us. So in March 2023 yet another recommissioning exercise took place. This time to get her ready for the 150-mile journey to the island. And it always amazes me with old vehicles that things that were working perfectly fine when you park them up suddenly stop working when you go to use them again. Such was the case with Leo's brake lights and indicators. They just didn't want to play ball. But fortunately Paul and myself managed to get them to see the light, quite literally, as we got them all working. 1960s and 1970s designed coach electrics aren't overly complicated. So a fiddle here and a squirt with WD-40 there and everything was good and working. And we would need everything working as we were booked on the midnight ferry that night and would mostly be travelling after dark. Our route would take us on the M20, the M26, the M25 and then down onto the A3. In hindsight, this probably isn't the greatest route to bring an old bus that's not seen a lot of action over the last few years, as there's quite a few sections of smart motorway on this route, and I don't know about you, I don't really like smart motorways. So several months later, when I brought my Bristol VR PKE 809M to the Isle of Wight, we came down along the south coast and travelled along the A27, which is a little bit of a more forgiving route. Anyway, back to Leo. We left Kent at 6 o'clock in the evening and had a fairly uneventful trip down to Portsmouth, stopping several times to make sure all was well with Leo. We arrived at Clarence Pier at Southsea at about 10:30 that night, and it gave me the opportunity to take several nice nighttime pictures of Leo, the last ones that would be taken on the mainland. Once we got to Gunwharf and Leo was sitting waiting for the ferry, well, I really knew everything was going to be alright, and the anxiety melted away. You can have the best maintained vehicles in the world, but there is always a real risk of something going wrong, and with an old preserved bus and coach, it can sometimes end up quite expensive. There is no doubt that Leo is living her best life now on the Isle of Wight. But those of you who know me know that there's more to me than just Leo. I have a few buses and they're all really loved. And every time I went back to Kent to visit, I would always see my Bristol VRs and I would think, oh, I wish I could take one of them back to the island with me. Unfortunately, logistics aren't always easy to work out and costs involved sometimes can be a little bit too high to do it all in one hit. But fortunately, in January 2024, I was in a position to at last bring PKE 809M down to the island. So yet another recommissioning took place, where we checked everything to make sure everything worked and was safe and legal. And you've guessed it, she needed a tyre change just like Leo. So we took 809 from the West Kent base at Ashford over to the East Kent base not far from Dover, where we had all the facilities to do all the work on her and make sure all was good. With this done, it was decided to run 809 on an auxiliary fuel tank because she'd been having a few issues with fuel contamination in the main tank. And this way you could guarantee she was getting nice clean diesel into her Gardner engine. Her last night in Kent was spent huddled up outside the East Kent depot, as quite literally there was no room at the inn. The depot was absolutely rammed. And so on January the 13th, what could possibly go wrong, we left Kent for the last time in 809. As I said before, we travelled down along the A27 as this gives us more chances and more places to stop to make checks on the vehicle. And it seemed to me that 809 enjoyed this route as well, as she managed to get up to speeds that no respectable 50-year-old Bristol VR should do. Clocking 57 miles an hour on the outskirts of Brighton. And no, that wasn't being driven over a cliff with a tailwind, before you ask. We made good time to Gunwharf at Portsmouth and crossed over on Victoria of Wight. And the next morning, after a much needed sleep, 809 was reunited with Leo at the Isle of Wight Military and Heritage Museum near Cowes. It was nice seeing them back together again, as they'd spent 3 years living together at the West Kent base. And I'm so pleased to have 809 on the island as well, because it means I can continue with the restoration of her that I started about 5 years ago back in Kent. The only downside is that they're both living outdoors and not undercover, which does tend to make extra work, but it's worth it having them living on the island with me. And as you can see, I've already started work on 809's bodywork, tidying her up and making her look a little bit more presentable, but that's the content for a future video. In the meantime, the next anxiety attack on wheels to hit the Isle of Wight will be Leyland Titan 553, new 553Y. And we've got ahead of the game here because we've started to prepare her already. She's not been on the road since 2012 and needs a water pipe, some belts changing and a full service. But I'm hoping she'll be on the island sometime in 2024. I hope you enjoyed these travelling tales. If you did, please like and share this video amongst your unsuspecting friends and family. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, as that helps the channel grow. And you'll get notifications on my latest releases. Don't forget to check out my other YouTube videos, which are all bus orientated. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.